The river no longer guided us as it had earlier in the morning. Its influence diminished gradually, giving way to a broader movement beneath the hull that carried a different weight and rhythm. The change required no adjustment. It announced itself clearly enough through motion alone. I remained at my position, watching the water where it met the vessel's side. The patterns there are often more instructive than any distant view. The flow had steadied, and the sound it produced had taken on a depth that suggested open water was close at hand. The sky showed no sign of alteration. The cloud cover held firm, even and unbroken, as though set in place deliberately. I acknowledged it and returned to my notes. There was nothing to be gained by revisiting the matter. I marked the next turning of the glass and carried forward the estimates already made. The figures agreed with one another closely enough. When that is the case, it is best to allow them to stand. On an earlier voyage, one that remained within the western reaches of the Mediterranean, I had encountered a similar stretch of grey sky that persisted far longer than expected. At the time, I remember feeling a subtle impatience, though there was no reason for it. The vessel had continued as she should, and the sea had offered no objection. That impatience did not return on later journeys. The banks were now distant enough that their presence was felt only in the way the air moved. The smell of the river had thinned, replaced by something cleaner and less distinct. I took note of it without assigning it importance. Such changes occur whether one observes them or not. The captain spoke briefly with one of the crew, then moved on. The vessel's routine had settled into a comfortable pattern, each man attending to his work without need for instruction. I have always found this stage of departure to be the most agreeable. The demands are light, and the work requires only attention. I checked the compass again and confirmed our heading. The needle remained faithful to its task, offering the same reading it had given before. There was no reason to question it. Instruments, like people, perform best when they are trusted. The water beneath us lifted the hull a little more distinctly now, the motion spreading through the vessel in a slow and even way. It was not yet a true swell, but it carried the promise of one. I adjusted my sense of speed accordingly, though the figures themselves required no revision. When I first began this work, I often struggled during such transitions. The shift from inland water to open sea can be subtle, and it is easy to overcorrect in response to it. Experience tempers that impulse. One learns to let the vessel speak first. The sky remained unchanged as the afternoon advanced. I noted the consistency of the light, which neither brightened nor dimmed in any significant way. It is during such hours that one becomes aware of how little the work depends on spectacle. I reviewed the day's progress once more, not because it demanded revision, but because the act itself reinforces order. The distance covered, the time passed, the course held. All were in agreement. I set the notes aside and allowed them to stand. The sound along the hull deepened further, steady and unbroken. It is a sound that carries easily through thought, asking nothing in return. I have often found that it marks the passage of time more effectively than the glass. I recalled another short journey, made years earlier between familiar ports, when I had first begun to rely on estimation rather than constant measurement. That passage had taught me the value of restraint. Too much attention can be as disruptive as too little. The river's final influence faded without ceremony. There was no clear boundary to mark the moment, only a gradual easing of one condition and the acceptance of another. The vessel responded as she should, settling into the broader movement beneath her. I made a note of the change and allowed the matter to rest. The course remained true. The wind held its quarter. The sky offered nothing new. As evening approached, the light softened slightly, though the cloud cover did not break. I adjusted my expectations accordingly and prepared for the hours ahead. There would be time enough later for further observation. For now, the work required only steadiness. I turned the glass once more, recorded the hour, and returned it to its place. The vessel continued on, carrying us quietly beyond the reach of the river and into the water that lay waiting beyond. The movement beneath the hull settled into a steadier rhythm as the last influence of the river eased away. There was no moment that marked the change clearly, only a gradual release, as though one current had loosened its grip and another had taken its place. The vessel responded without hesitation, accepting the broader water beneath her as readily as she had accepted the narrower channel before. I remained at my post, watching the water where it passed along the hull. The patterns there spoke plainly enough. The flow had evened out, and the sound it carried had deepened into something more uniform. It was the sound of distance, not yet fully realized, but no longer postponed. The sky remained unchanged. The cloud cover held steady, low and even, allowing no edge of light to sharpen or fade. I acknowledged it as I had all morning and made no further note. Some conditions require attention. Others require only acceptance. I turned the glass and marked the hour. The sand moved as it should, settling without pause. I found comfort in that regularity. Time measured in this way does not hurry. It passes at the pace it chooses, indifferent to expectation. The tide had slackened further now, its earlier assistance replaced by a more neutral presence. I adjusted my estimates to reflect the change, though the numbers themselves shifted very little. The vessel's pace remained even. When adjustments are small, it is often best to leave them that way. On earlier voyages, when my work kept me close to shore, I had often mistaken the tide's influence for something more complex. It took several passages before I learned how easily one can attribute intention to water that is merely moving as it always has. That lesson returned to me now, quietly, without need for repetition. The air carried less of the river's scent as we progressed. What remained was faint and indistinct, and neither pleasant nor unpleasant, simply present. I noted it without assigning it meaning. Smells, like sounds, change whether one attends to them or not. The crew moved about their work with little conversation. Each man knew his place, and the vessel responded accordingly. I have always preferred departures that unfold in this manner. When routine asserts itself early, it tends to hold. I checked the compass again, not because it demanded confirmation, but because the act itself reinforces order. The needle remained steady, showing the same reading it had given before. I accepted it and moved on. The water's motion became more pronounced beneath us, though still gentle. The hull lifted and settled in a slow, even cadence that required no adjustment. It was not yet the swell of open ocean, but it carried its suggestion clearly enough. I recalled a shorter passage made years earlier along the southern coast, when I had first begun to trust dead reckoning over constant reference to land. That voyage had been unremarkable in every sense, yet it taught me more than many longer ones. Progress measured without sight has a way of clarifying thought. The sky showed no sign of yielding as the day continued. I made no effort to anticipate its change. Experience has taught me that anticipation invites distraction. It is better to proceed as conditions allow and to accept what presents itself. I reviewed the distance covered since the morning and compared it to the time past. The figures agreed closely enough. When such agreement occurs, there is little to be gained by pressing further. I set the matter aside. The sound of water along the hull remained constant, its tone unbroken. At first it drew the ear. Later it receded into the background, becoming part of the vessel itself. This is how most useful sounds behave. They announce themselves, then fade into function. On one of my earliest voyages, I remember struggling to ignore such sounds, attending to each change as though it carried instruction. It took time to learn that constancy is itself a form of guidance. The captain passed nearby once more, his attention directed ahead. We exchanged no words. There was nothing that required them. The vessel's motion spoke plainly enough. As the afternoon wore on, the light altered slightly, though the cloud cover remained intact. The change was subtle, more a softening than a shift. I noted it without expectation. Light, like water, moves according to its own rules. I turned the glass again and marked the hour. The act required no thought. My hand moved as it always had, and I allowed it to do so without interruption. The tide's influence was now fully spent. What remained was the broader movement of the water beyond the river's reach. The vessel accepted it without hesitation, settling into a rhythm that promised continuity rather than change. I made a note of the transition and allowed it to stand. There was nothing to resolve. The course held. The pace remained even. The sky offered nothing new. In earlier years, such moments would have invited reflection. I have since learned that reflection is best reserved for times when it is required. Routine sustains itself most effectively when left undisturbed. The water beneath us carried the vessel forward steadily, its motion unbroken. I returned my attention to the compass once more, confirmed what I already knew, and let the matter rest. The hours passed without insistence. Each was marked, recorded, and released in turn. It is in such passage that confidence is built, not through assertion, but through repetition. I turned the glass again, made my note, and allowed the vessel to continue on her way, carrying us quietly beyond the last influence of the river and into the broader water that lay ahead. The movement beneath the hull grew broader as the last traces of the river's influence faded entirely. The water carried a different weight now, its motion slower to change and more deliberate in its direction. The vessel responded without hesitation, settling into a rhythm that required no correction. I remained attentive to the sound along the hull. It had deepened further, losing the softer character of inland water and taking on a steadier tone. This was the sound of distance, beginning its work, though distance itself remained only a measure. not yet a presence. The sky remained closed. The cloud cover showed no thinning at the edges, no softening of its uniformity. I noted the persistence of it and allowed the matter to rest. Such skies are not uncommon near the coast in early spring, and they often linger longer than one expects. I turned the glass and marked the hour. The sand moved evenly, without pause or hesitation. I have always trusted the glass more than the sky. One measures time, the other merely suggests it. The vessel's pace held steady as the water widened around us. The wind remained light, pressing the sails just enough to keep her moving without strain. I confirmed the heading once more against the compass. The needle held its line, offering no reason for concern. In earlier years, when I first began venturing beyond familiar waters, I would often look for signs of open sea, as though they might announce themselves clearly. I have since learned that such transitions rarely declare their arrival. They occur gradually, revealing themselves only through consistency. The air carried less warmth than it had closer to shore, though the change was subtle. I noted it more by habit than necessity. Air, like water, shifts without asking to be observed. I reviewed the distance covered since our last record and compared it to the time past. The figures agreed within the bounds I had expected. When such agreement occurs, it is best not to disturb it with unnecessary revision. The sky offered no opportunity for observation. I did not wait upon it. Dead reckoning served as it always had, drawing on course, speed, and time rather than light. I have found this method most reliable when conditions remain unchanged. On one of my earliest crossings, made not far from these same waters, I recall feeling unsettled by the absence of the sun for several days. At the time, I believed the difficulty lay in the method itself. It was only later that I understood the difficulty lay in my impatience. The vessel continued on her course, without variation. The water beneath her carried the motion forward evenly, lifting and settling the hull in a slow cadence that invited no intervention. I adjusted nothing and allowed the rhythm to establish itself. The crew moved quietly about their work. There was little conversation, and none was required. Each man attended to his task, as though the vessel itself had dictated the order of things. I have always found this stage of a voyage to be the most agreeable. I turned the glass again and marked the hour. The act required no thought. My hand moved as it always had, guided by repetition rather than intention. The sky remained unchanged as the afternoon advanced. The light softened slightly, though no break appeared in the cloud cover. I made no effort to anticipate a clearing. Experience has taught me that anticipation serves no practical purpose. The water's motion remained steady, its direction unambiguous. I confirmed the course once more and allowed the matter to rest. There was no disagreement between the compass, the vessel's movement, and the time recorded. I recalled a shorter passage made years earlier, when I had relied too heavily on the promise of a noon sight that never came. That day had taught me the value of proceeding without expectation. Progress measured by routine often proves more reliable than progress measured by hope. The sound along the hull continued unbroken. At times, it drew the ear. At others, it faded entirely into the background. I have learned to trust both responses equally. I made another note, carrying forward the estimates already established. The figures required no adjustment. When numbers agree, it is best to let them remain so. The horizon, such as it could be discerned beneath the cloud cover, showed no variation. Sea and sky met without distinction, their boundary softened by the even light. I noted the lack of definition and moved on. On earlier voyages, this absence would have unsettled me. I would have sought contrast where none existed, inventing reference where none was required. Experience has a way of quieting such habits. The vessel's motion remained unchanged as the day continued. The wind held its quarter. The sails answered it without complaint. I observed the agreement and allowed it to continue. I turned the glass once more and marked the hour. The passage of time announced itself only through repetition. There were no events to divide it, no moments that demanded attention. The sky offered nothing new. I did not press it for answers. The work continued as it always had, guided by measure rather than sight. As the light shifted toward evening, the air cooled slightly. The change was gradual, noticed only because I had learned to expect it. I noted it and returned my attention to the vessel's movement. The water beneath us carried the hull forward steadily, its motion broad and unbroken. I confirmed the course again, accepted the reading, and set the matter aside. There was nothing to resolve. The estimates held. The method remained sound. The vessel continued on her way, carrying us quietly farther from the last certainty of land and deeper into the routine of open water. I turned the glass, made my note, and allowed the hours to pass as they would, each one marked, recorded, and released in turn. The water beneath the hull carried a broader motion now, one that did not yield quickly to small changes. The vessel answered it with a steadiness that felt earned rather than imposed. I observed the movement without expectation and allowed it to continue. The sound along the hull had settled into a deeper register, its rhythm slower and more even than before. It was no longer shaped by banks or channels. Instead, it reflected the larger body of water that now held us. I found that the ear adjusts to such changes more readily than the eye. The sky remained closed, its surface unbroken and without feature. The light that filtered through it was even and diffuse, offering no sharpness by which to judge time. I noted the consistency and turned my attention elsewhere. I reviewed the course we had been holding and compared it to the vessel's motion. There was no divergence worth remarking upon. When movement and measure align quietly, there is little reason to interfere. The wind continued from its earlier quarter, unchanged in strength. The sails answered it without strain, and the hull carried forward as she had since leaving the river's reach. I allowed the arrangement to stand. On earlier coastal passages, I would often look for the moment when the sea first asserted itself, as though it might announce its presence clearly. I have since learned that the sea does not require acknowledgement. It makes itself known through persistence, not display. I returned to my notes and extended the record forward, carrying with it the assumptions already made. Dead reckoning, when practiced with patience, gains strength through continuity. Each estimate supports the next, provided one resists the urge to revise without cause. The crew remained settled into their work, their movements steady and unhurried. There was no sense of departure now, only continuation. I have always found this transition reassuring. When a voyage ceases to feel like a beginning, it often proceeds more smoothly. The air carried a faint coolness that lingered without shifting. I noticed it less with each passing hour until it became part of the background rather than a feature. Such changes tend to matter less once they stop announcing themselves. I glanced again at the compass and found the needle where I expected it to be. Its steadiness required no further comment. Instruments that behave predictably earn trust through repetition. Time passed without punctuation. I noted its passage through habit rather than attention, letting the routine carry the record forward. The work did not demand focus so much as presence. The water's motion remained unchanged, lifting and settling the hull in a slow cadence that invited no correction. I adjusted nothing and allowed the vessel to maintain her course. I recalled a passage made years earlier when I had first begun to rely on extended dead reckoning rather than frequent reference to land or sky. That voyage had taught me the value of restraint. Adjustments made too often tend to introduce more error than they resolve. The sky offered no opportunity for observation. I did not regard this as a limitation. The method at hand was sufficient, and sufficiency is often preferable to precision when conditions remain stable. I extended the estimates once more, carrying them forward through the hours already past. The figures required no amendment. Their agreement was quiet and unremarkable, which is how such agreement is best encountered. The horizon remained indistinct beneath the cloud cover. Its boundaries softened until sea and sky appeared to share the same tone. I noted the lack of contrast and allowed my attention to return to the vessel's movement. The sound along the hull continued without interruption. At times, it receded entirely from awareness. At others, it returned gently, reminding me of the water's presence without insisting upon it. The wind held steady as the light shifted toward evening. The change was gradual, marked more by temperature than by sight. I recorded the transition and moved on. There was nothing in the arrangement of sea, wind, or vessel that suggested the need for change. I accepted this and allowed the hours to continue unfolding as they had before. The record advanced without complication. Each entry followed the last, not as a progression, but as a continuation. This is how most useful work proceeds, without emphasis and without pause. The vessel carried on, her motion broad and unbroken, drawing us farther into the routine of open water. I remained with the work, attentive but unhurried, and let the evening settle in as it chose. The light diminished gradually as evening settled over the water, though the sky itself showed little change. The cloud cover remained intact, its tone darkening only by degree rather than by shift. I noted the loss of daylight, more by temperature than by sight. The water beneath the hull carried a broader motion now, one that lifted and settled the vessel with greater regularity. It was not forceful, but it was persistent. I adjusted my sense of time to match it, and allowed the rhythm to establish itself. As the first night watch took its place, the vessel's sounds became more pronounced. The movement of water along the hull deepened, and the creak of lines under steady load emerged briefly before fading again. None of it required attention. It was simply the ship continuing as she had begun. I extended the record into the evening hours, carrying forward the estimates already made. The course held, and the wind remained steady, though its pressure on the sails increased slightly as the air cooled. I noted the change and left the arrangement intact. The crew moved with quieter purpose as darkness gathered. Voices dropped without instruction, and tasks were carried out with less conversation. I observed this as part of the transition, rather than as a change in behavior. Night brings its own order. A meal was taken earlier than usual, the timing adjusted to match the light rather than the glass. The fare was simple and unremarkable, eaten quickly and without pause. I noted the shift only because it marked the first departure from daytime routine. As the night deepened, the wind freshened slightly, its presence announced by a sharper tone in the rigging. The vessel answered it without protest, though the motion beneath us grew more insistent. I adjusted the course by a small degree and allowed the change to stand. A brief squall passed through shortly after. It announced itself well in advance, the air cooling and the water's surface tightening before the first rain arrived. The crew made their adjustments without haste, each movement familiar and practiced. During the squall, I attended more closely to time and course, noting the intervals between each measure rather than relying on longer spans. The compass remained steady, and the vessel's response was consistent. There was no need for correction beyond what had already been made. The rain passed as it had come, without ceremony. The wind eased back to its earlier strength, and the vessel resumed her previous rhythm. I extended the estimates forward once more, satisfied that the interruption had not altered them in any meaningful way. The sound of water along the hull returned to its earlier pattern, broad and even. At times it pressed forward into awareness, at others it receded entirely, leaving only the sense of motion itself. A minor disagreement arose among the crew during the next watch change, brief and low in tone. It resolved itself without intervention, the matter forgotten as quickly as it had appeared. Such moments are inevitable when time stretches and tasks repeat. I noted the passage of another hour and continued the record. The work required no more than presence. Each measure followed the last without insistence. The air cooled further as the night progressed, though the change was gradual. The vessel's motion remained unchanged, and the course continued to hold. I observed the consistency and allowed it to continue. Food was taken again later than expected, more as a formality than a necessity. The routine shifted to accommodate the watches rather than the other way around. I noted the adaptation and moved on. Another band of unsettled weather passed nearby without crossing our path, its presence suggested only by a brief change in wind direction and a tightening of the water's surface. I adjusted nothing and allowed the vessel to proceed. As the night wore on, fatigue appeared quietly among the crew, visible more in posture than in performance. Tasks were completed more slowly, though no less accurately. I recorded the observation, without comment. The water beneath us carried the hull forward steadily, its motion unchanged by the hours that had passed. I confirmed the course once more and allowed the record to continue. The night settled into routine once again, its earlier interruptions absorbed into the broader pattern of motion and time. I remained with the work, attentive without strain, and allowed the hours to pass as they would. The night held steady after the earlier unsettled weather passed, its character unchanged by the hours that followed. The sky remained closed, offering no stars by which to measure progress. I noted the absence without concern. The course had been set, and the vessel continued as she had through the evening. The water beneath the hull carried a broad, even motion now, lifting and settling the ship without insistence. The sound along the planking was constant, neither rising nor falling in tone. I allowed it to remain in the background as the work of the watch drew to its close. The next measure of time arrived without distinction. I recorded it and completed the remaining notes for the night, extending the estimates forward with no alteration. There was nothing in the vessel's motion that suggested otherwise. With the record complete, I left the deck to the men who would remain through the night and made my way below. The transition was familiar, marked by a softening of sound and a narrowing of space. Below decks, the ship's movement felt closer, more personal, as though the hull itself carried the night inward. In my cabin, the air was still. The faint motion of the ship reached the walls gently, enough to be felt, but not enough to disturb. I set aside the instruments and allowed the day to settle behind me. I reviewed the hours that had passed, not in detail but in shape. The departure, the widening water, the brief unsettled weather, and the return to routine. Each had taken its place without requiring more than attention. There is comfort in days that require no explanation. I took up my journal once more, adding a final line to mark the close of the day. The words were brief and unadorned. They needed only to be sufficient. Afterward, I prepared a letter, one that would wait until we reached a port willing to receive it. I wrote knowing it would travel slowly, carried by hands and routes yet unknown. That knowledge did not trouble me. It suited the pace of the words. I wrote of the weather in general terms and of the vessel's steady progress. I mentioned the lengthening days and the cooler nights and how the sea had taken on a broader motion since we left the river behind. These were safe things to set down. I wrote also of home, though less directly. I noted small details remembered rather than events anticipated. The sound of footsteps in the morning, the way light settles in a room when the day is clear. These things return more readily at sea than one might expect. I did not write of distance. Distance speaks for itself. There were thoughts I did not commit to the page. Worries tend to lose their shape when left unwritten, and hopes require no record to remain present. I allowed those to pass without interruption. The ship continued on, her motion unchanged by my absence from the deck. I felt it through the narrow frame of the cabin, steady and unhurried. It was enough. I set the letter aside and secured the journal. The work of the day had concluded, and there was nothing more to add. What remained would carry itself until morning. I lay back and allowed the sound of the water to return, filtered now through wood and distance. The night held its course, and the vessel held hers. Tomorrow would come when it chose to. For now, the ship moved on, and that was sufficient. Morning arrived without ceremony. The light changed first, softening at the edges before brightening enough to mark the day's return. The sky remained closed, its cover unbroken, offering no direct sign of the sun's position. I noted the hour by habit rather than by sight and returned to the deck. The air carried the coolness of night still, though it was easing. The vessel moved as she had through the dark hours, her motion steady and unaltered by the change of watch. The water beneath us held its course, broad and even. I reviewed the work left from the night and carried it forward into the morning. The estimates held. There was no reason to disturb them. When the day begins without clear markers, continuity becomes its own reference. The crew stirred gradually, each man taking his place without instruction. Movements were slower at first, shaped by the lingering quiet rather than by fatigue. The ship's routine reasserted itself as the light strengthened. The sky showed no interest in clearing. I acknowledged this and turned my attention to the measures already in hand. A morning without a sun is not uncommon in these waters, and it asks only patience. I extended the course forward through the early hours, relying on the vessel's movement, the wind's consistency, and the passage of time. The method required no embellishment. It had carried us through the night and would continue to do so. The sound along the hull remained constant, its tone unchanged from the hours before. It blended with the low movement of the ship, forming a background that required no attention to interpret. A simple meal was taken on deck as the day settled in. The timing followed the watch rather than the clock, and the fare was unchanged from the night before. I observed the familiarity of it and returned to the work. There was a brief adjustment to the sails as the wind shifted slightly, more in angle than in strength. The vessel answered the change without delay, and the motion beneath us remained even. I recorded the adjustment and let it stand. The horizon remained indistinct, its line softened by the low cloud. Sea and the sky met without definition, offering no contrast by which to judge distance. I did not regard this as a hindrance. The work did not depend on clarity of view. I recalled earlier passages when the absence of a morning sight had unsettled me more than it should have. With time I learned that such absences are part of the pattern, not interruptions to it. The hours advanced quietly. Each was marked, noted and released without insistence. The vessel's course held, and the water beneath us carried her forward without variation. There was nothing in the arrangement of wind, sea, or motion that suggested change. I allowed the day to continue as it had begun, guided by routine rather than expectation. The sky remained closed as the morning wore on. I accepted this and carried the record forward once more, confident that the method in use required no immediate confirmation. The ship moved on, steady and unhurried, her progress measured not by sight, but by continuity. I remained with the work, attentive without strain, and let the morning settle into its familiar shape. The day continued much as the morning had begun, its shape defined more by repetition than by change. The sky remained closed, and the water carried the vessel forward with the same broad motion that had held since nightfall. I noted the consistency and allowed it to remain undisturbed. As the hours passed, I found myself recalling earlier voyages made closer to home, when the sea was narrower and the land more familiar. Those passages had followed their own routines, shaped by coastlines and ports known well enough to require little thought. The work then had been no less careful, though it had felt different in its familiarity. In the Mediterranean, mornings often announced themselves more clearly. Light sharpened sooner, and the sun made its presence known without hesitation. Here, the day arrived quietly, its markers softened by cloud and distance. I noted the contrast without preference. Each had its own order. I extended the record forward through the middle hours of the day, carrying the estimates with the same care I had used before. The figures required no adjustment. They rested easily alongside one another, supported by time rather than by sight. The vessel's motion remained unchanged, her progress steady and unremarkable. I observed the agreement between sea, wind, and course, and returned to the work without further thought. During quieter moments, memory tends to surface without invitation. I recalled mornings at home, when routine followed a different pattern, shaped less by watch and more by shared habit. Sundays marked by mass taken together, the familiar cadence of words heard often enough to require no effort to follow. At sea, such routines change, though they do not disappear entirely. I have learned to carry them inward, keeping what can be kept and setting aside what must wait. Faith, like navigation, endures best when practiced steadily, rather than displayed. There are moments during the day when I pause briefly, not for instruction, but for acknowledgement. The passage of time, the steadiness of the vessel, the order that persists even when sight is limited. These require no explanation, only recognition. I do not mark such moments in the log. They belong elsewhere. The crew continued their work without interruption, their movements shaped by repetition rather than urgency. The vessel answered them as she had since our departure, her motion unchanged by the hours that passed. I returned my attention to the measures at hand and carried them forward once more. The sky offered no new reference, and none was required. The method remained sound. As the day moved on, the light shifted subtly, its quality changing without altering the sky's uniform cover. I noted the passage and allowed it to stand. In earlier years, I might have sought meaning in such sameness. With time, I have come to understand that constancy does not require interpretation. It simply continues. The water beneath us carried the hull forward steadily, its motion unchanged. I remained with the work, attentive without strain, and allowed the day to settle into its familiar rhythm. The swell had settled into a steady pattern by the middle of the day, its rise and fall no longer changing in character but repeating itself with quiet insistence. The vessel answered it without hesitation, her movement now shaped more by the breadth of the sea than by any remaining influence of land. I observed the motion as I had since morning, not by sight alone, but by the way it carried through the hull. Each lift followed the last with little variation. It was the kind of regularity that invites trust. The sky remained closed, its cover unbroken and even. Light filtered through without direction, offering no clear reference. I noted the hour by habit and extended the record forward, carrying the estimates with it. The captain came on deck shortly after, his presence marked less by sound than by the way the crew adjusted themselves. Conversations ended without instruction. Movements became more deliberate. I continued my work as before. He stood near the rail for a time, observing the water ahead. When he spoke, it was to issue a brief correction to the course, delivered without emphasis. The change was small. The effect was immediate. I acknowledged the order and made the adjustment. The vessel answered it without complaint. The captain remained a moment longer, watching the result, then turned away without further comment. Order once established requires little maintenance. Later, when the deck had quieted again, he returned to my position and spoke more softly, his words intended only for me. He asked after the estimates and the condition of the swell. I answered plainly. He listened without interruption. For a moment the formality eased. He remarked that the sea had taken hold of us sooner than expected. I agreed. The exchange was brief, professional, and sufficient. When footsteps approached, the familiarity withdrew at once. He resumed his place as captain, and I returned to the record. The boundary between ranks reasserted itself without effort. The crew took their meal under his eye, the routine carried out efficiently and without delay. There was little conversation. Plates were cleared promptly. The watch resumed its shape. The swell continued unchanged through the afternoon, its regular motion now fully established. I extended the estimates again, carrying them forward with confidence born of repetition. The figures aligned with the vessel's movement and the time recorded. I noted the consistency and moved on. The sound along the hull deepened, its tone broadened by the water's regular rise and fall. It no longer varied enough to draw attention. Instead, it remained constant, a steady companion to the work. A minor correction was made to the set of the sails as the wind shifted slightly in angle. The captain observed the change, nodded once and said nothing further. The adjustment held. I have always found that the sea settles more easily when the ship's order is firm. Routine responds well to authority, when authority does not waver. As the hours passed, fatigue appeared quietly among the crew, visible more in posture than in performance. The captain noticed it before it became a concern. Watches were rotated with minimal instruction. The work continued. The sky offered no new reference. I did not seek one. Dead reckoning remained sufficient, supported by time, course, and the vessel's steady response to the swell. I extended the record once more, letting the repetition of the work carry it forward. The method did not require innovation. It required attention. The afternoon stretched on without interruption, the swell maintaining its regular rise and fall beneath the hull. Each motion followed the last, with little variation, enough to be felt clearly, but not enough to demand attention. The vessel moved as though the water itself had agreed to carry her forward at a measured pace. I remained with the record, extending it through the hours that followed. The estimates continued to support one another, not through precision, but through consistency. When time, course, and motion align for long enough, they require less supervision. The captain returned to the deck once more, his presence again altering the tone of the space without the need for instruction. He observed the set of the sails and the line of the horizon for several moments before speaking. A small adjustment was ordered, not in response to error, but to maintain the discipline of the course. The change was made at once. The vessel answered it without complaint. He remained until the effect was clear, then moved on, leaving the order intact behind him. Nothing else was said. Nothing else was required. The crew worked under that order with practiced familiarity. Tasks were completed efficiently, movements economical. Even conversation, when it occurred, remained brief and subdued. I noted the passage of another interval and extended the record forward again. The swell showed no sign of diminishing. Its regularity had become the defining feature of the day. In the hours that followed, the ship's routine settled deeper into itself. Watches rotated, meals were taken. The sound of water along the hull continued without variation, its presence now fully absorbed into the background of thought. I adjusted the record once more, not because the figures demanded it, but because the habit itself reinforces continuity. The act of writing carries time forward as surely as the vessel carries distance. The captain addressed the crew briefly near the change of watch, his words few and precise. There was no need to raise his voice. Order responded to expectation as readily as it did to command. When he spoke to me again, it was to confirm what had already been observed. The swell remained steady. The course held. The night would require no alteration to the arrangement already in place. We exchanged no further words. The understanding between officers does not require repetition. As the light began to soften toward evening, the sky showed no sign of breaking. The cloud cover remained unbroken, its tone deepening without revealing structure. I acknowledged the change in light and continued the work. The water beneath us carried the hull forward steadily, its motion unchanged by the hours already past. Fatigue appeared quietly among the crew, though it did not interfere with performance. The captain noticed it and adjusted the watch without comment. I extended the record again, letting the repetition of the work carry it forward. There was no need to seek variation where none was required. The swell continued through the later hours, its rhythm now fully familiar. The vessel answered it without hesitation, her movement disciplined and unhurried. As evening settled in, the captain made his final inspection of the deck. Satisfied, he left the watch in capable hands and withdrew below. The order he had set remained, unchanged by his absence. The crew continued their work as they had under his eye, the routine holding firm. I remained at my post, attentive but unstrained, and allowed the hours to pass as they would. The sea held its course. The ship held hers. Time advanced without insistence, marked only by repetition and motion. The captain returned briefly near evening, scanned the horizon, and gave a final instruction regarding the night watches. His voice carried no urgency. It did not need to. When he left the deck, the order he had set remained behind him. The crew continued, as they had under his eye, the rhythm unchanged. The swell held through the later hours, its motion now familiar enough to fade into the background. I remained with the work, attentive without strain, and allowed the sea to set the pace as it had all day. The vessel moved on, steady and disciplined, carried forward by water that had found its rhythm and a ship that had accepted it. The Atlantic, once fully entered, ceases to present itself as distance and becomes instead an atmosphere. There is a particular threshold in every crossing when the memory of departure loses its immediacy, yet the promise of arrival remains abstract. It is within that threshold that the navigator's discipline is most thoroughly tested, not by violence, nor by uncertainty, but by endurance. The wind had steadied into a faithful pattern. It arrived from the east with sufficient constancy that the sails required only minor trimming at the change of each watch. The vessel leaned with modest inclination, her bow dividing the swell without resistance. The creak of timber had settled into a predictable cadence, no longer a complaint, but a language of adjustment. I rose before dawn as I had each morning since the first day beyond the river's mouth. The air at that hour held a coolness that would later dissolve beneath the sun, though here in open water even warmth arrives with restraint. The horizon, uninterrupted in all directions, carried the faintest gradient of pale light before the sun's ascent. In those early minutes, the sea reflects the sky's hesitance. The surface appears metallic, subdued, as though awaiting instruction. I cast the log line with deliberate care. The knotted intervals slipped from the coil and into the sea, each marked by the measured count of sand through the glass. When the call was made, the line was drawn back in, heavy with salt. The calculation required no correction. We advanced as expected. Expectation, however, must never replace confirmation. I entered the numbers into the logbook and allowed my hand to rest briefly upon the page. The ink, slightly thickened by humidity, required a moment longer to settle. The crew stirred gradually, footsteps upon the deck, the low murmur of conversation, the clatter of simple utensils against wood. There is comfort in such small sounds when the larger world offers only wind and water. By mid-morning the swell had lengthened further, rising beneath us in broad, dignified arcs. The vessel responded without protest. Each descent into the trough felt less abrupt than in earlier days, as though the sea itself had resolved into steadiness. Flying fish began to appear in brief flashes, startling silver arcs that broke the surface and vanished again within moments. Their presence drew brief laughter from younger crewmen. Even disciplined men require interruption. Toward noon, the sky revealed a clearer window than had been granted in previous days. I brought the sextant to my eye once more, aligning the lower limb of the sun with the trembling horizon. The vessel's motion complicates precision. One must anticipate the swell's rise and fall, allowing the instrument to settle into alignment at the precise moment of balance. The angle confirmed our latitude within tolerable variance. There is no triumph in accuracy at sea. There is only quiet affirmation. The captain joined me shortly thereafter. "You are content with our progress?" he asked. "Content is not the word," I replied. "We are aligned." He considered that for a moment. "Alignment will suffice." He lingered beside me, gazing outward across the unbroken horizon. "Men grow restless when nothing changes," he said at length. "Nothing changes visibly," I corrected. "Much changes beneath." He regarded me sidelong. "You speak of currents, of patience." He allowed the faintest inclination of his head before returning to his duties. Restlessness aboard ship rarely manifests in open defiance. It emerges instead in subtle inefficiencies. Tasks performed without full attention, glances cast too frequently toward the horizon, conversations revisited without purpose. I took note of these small shifts. The sea remained vast, and we sailed on. By the 40th day beyond the last sight of Spain, the Atlantic had ceased to feel like a body of water, and had instead become the condition in which we existed. The notion of departure had faded. The promise of arrival remained theoretical. Between those 2 points lay nothing but repetition, measured in wind, swell, and discipline. The trade winds had settled into a steady breath that neither faltered nor surged. They pressed against the canvas with consistency that bordered on indifference. The sails remained full, the lines taut without strain, the hull angled just enough to suggest forward purpose. The sound of wind along rigging no longer drew attention. It had become a background tone against which all other perception was measured. Morning followed morning with little variation in appearance. Before the sun lifted itself above the horizon, the sea wore a metallic sheen, subdued and colourless, reflecting the sky's hesitation. I rose before the bell as habit required, and moved to the rail, testing the air with a slow inhalation. The scent was unchanged: salt, faint timber, distant moisture. I cast the log line in silence. The knotted cord slid over the stern and into the wake, disappearing in measured increments. The sand glass emptied at its appointed interval. The line was retrieved wet and heavy, and the count announced. The numbers agreed with expectation. Agreement is not excitement. It is affirmation. I entered the figure into the logbook with deliberate script, allowing the ink to settle before closing the cover. The book had grown thick with entries, each line nearly identical in structure, each day distinguished only by subtle degrees of variation. The crew moved about the deck with compliance rather than vigour. Fatigue had not broken them. It had settled upon them. Their steps were slower, though still precise. Speech was economical, laughter rare but not absent. On the 42nd day, a quiet tension surfaced without clear origin. It did not erupt into argument. It manifested instead in silence, prolonged, heavy, unshared. 2 men, avoided eye contact over a trivial misplacement of tools. Another lingered too long at the rail, staring westward as though land might rise from insistence alone. The captain observed without interference. He did not chastise idleness. He did not rally them with speech. He allowed the crossing itself to instruct. That evening, as the sun lowered in muted orange behind thin haze, he joined me near the helm. "They count days," he said quietly. "They will count weeks," I replied. "And when they lose count, they will remember discipline." He studied the horizon, then the compass. "You speak as though the sea is patient." "It is," I said, "with those who are." The stars emerged gradually after dusk, first faint and hesitant, then in greater number as the darkness deepened. The sky had cleared entirely for the first time in several nights. I brought the sextant from its case and aligned the instrument with the horizon. The swell complicated the angle. The vessel rose and fell with measured insistence. I waited through multiple oscillations before taking the reading, timing the alignment at the brief instant of balance. The altitude confirmed our latitude with reassuring precision. Polaris sat lower than in the early days of the voyage, yet steady. Other constellations had shifted subtly in their ascent. I traced their positions without urgency, marking each in the logbook with the same restrained script. Navigation at night requires stillness within motion. The sea moves, the vessel moves, the sky appears fixed. It is the navigator who must reconcile all three. Below deck the warmth had intensified. The timbers retained heat through the night. Sleep came reluctantly to many. I heard the turning of bodies in narrow berths, the quiet exhalations of men adjusting to confinement. I returned to my cabin and unfolded the letter once more. "My dear Isabel, the sea has become both road and dwelling. We move steadily west, yet distance no longer presents itself as progress. It is simply continuity. The men endure. The captain remains firm without harshness. The wind serves us faithfully." I paused. How does one describe sameness without diminishing it? There is a peace in repetition when fear has departed. The sea does not threaten. It merely persists. I set down the pen and allowed the lantern's light to flicker against the cabin wall. The motion of the hull beneath my feet had become so familiar that its absence would have been more unsettling than its presence. On the 45th day, a bank of cloud rose unexpectedly to the southwest. It did not carry the vertical aggression of storm, but rather a slow accumulation that dimmed the horizon gradually. The wind freshened by a modest degree, enough to require attention but not alarm. The captain ordered minor adjustments to sail. No urgency attended the command. The sea responded with slightly shortened swell. The bow met the water with a firmer cadence. Spray reached the forward deck in finer sheets. The crew adjusted without complaint. I recalculated our drift conservatively, accounting for the altered wind angle. The compass needle remained faithful. though its movement appeared exaggerated by the vessel's increased pitch. "Hold steady," I instructed the helmsman. He did. Rain arrived briefly near midnight, not in sheets but in fine persistent lines that blurred the boundary between sea and sky. The horizon dissolved entirely. For a time the world consisted only of wind and motion. I remained beside the helm, counting intervals by glass, adjusting course by degrees too small to register outwardly. In such hours, navigation becomes interior. The sky offers no guidance. The sea provides no markers. One relies upon accumulated memory, wind direction before cloud, swell orientation before darkness. The vessel's preferred lean when true to course. By dawn, the cloud thinned, and the rain ceased. The sea resumed its longer breathing. We had neither wandered nor deviated beyond correction. The crew's spirits lifted slightly in the renewed light. Flying fish scattered before the bow in quick silver arcs. The air held warmth even at early hour. I tested the water temperature again by bucket and found it risen another slight degree. Change continued beneath steadiness. Days later, faint strands of floating vegetation appeared intermittently in our wake. Thin, unremarkable, easily dismissed by an untrained eye. I did not dismiss them. Currents carry memory of land long before land is visible. I adjusted nothing. Instead, I allowed expectation to remain internal. The crossing had entered its long middle. The Atlantic no longer challenged us with spectacle. It demanded endurance without distraction. And so, we sailed on. By the 50th day, west of Spain, the sea had grown so constant that even its immensity no longer impressed the senses. The Atlantic did not rage, nor did it calm. It persisted in long, deliberate breathing, lifting the hull and lowering it again with patient repetition. The horizon remained unbroken in every direction, a perfect ring dividing water from sky with almost mathematical precision. If a man stared too long at that line, he might begin to doubt whether movement truly occurred at all. Yet we moved. The log confirmed it each morning. The wake streamed aft in a pale ribbon beneath the stern. The compass needle held its quiet allegiance to the west-southwest. And each evening, when the stars cleared sufficiently to permit measurement, the numbers in the book aligned with expectation. We were not drifting. We were not circling. We were advancing, though nothing in the visible world seemed to acknowledge that fact. The crew had adjusted to the crossing in the way men adjust to seasons. The restlessness that had stirred weeks earlier had settled into a steadier discipline. Conversation came in measured intervals, rarely rising above the pitch of wind along the rigging. Tasks were performed without flourish. Even fatigue had found its place within routine. A man might yawn at the rail, stretch his shoulders against stiffness, then return to his duty without complaint. On a morning of unusual clarity, the sky opened without a single thread of cloud. The light at dawn was pale and clean, casting the sea in faint silver. I stood beside the foremast and watched the swell approach from the east in long, even lines. Each crest bore a darker edge, its shadow deepening, before passing beneath us. The hull responded with gentle ascent and descent, neither abrupt nor hesitant. There is a moment, during prolonged passages, when the sea ceases to be an obstacle and becomes instead a companion. It offers no encouragement, yet it no longer feels adversarial. One begins to understand its rhythm not as force, but as condition. The Atlantic does not oppose the vessel. It simply exists, and we exist within it. Near midday, the wind shifted slightly northward. The change was subtle enough that only the angle of sail revealed it at first. Canvas fluttered once, then filled again at a marginally altered orientation. The captain noted it without comment and signalled for minor adjustment. The crew responded with quiet coordination, easing one line, tightening another. The ship resumed her preferred lean. Such small alterations marked our days. I measured the sun at its height with careful patience, allowing the instrument to settle despite the vessel's steady motion. The angle differed only modestly from the previous day, yet the progression was undeniable. Latitude confirmed our steady descent toward warmer waters. I marked the figure in the logbook and closed it gently, aware that numbers carry a comfort beyond their practical function. They reassure the mind when the eyes perceive only sameness. The heat had grown more pronounced in recent days. By late afternoon, the deck planks warmed beneath the hand. The air, though moving steadily, carried a thickness absent earlier in the voyage. The men shed outer layers where propriety allowed. Water consumption increased. I ordered the casks inspected and the distribution monitored, not from concern but from prudence. Flying fish appeared more frequently now, scattering in glimmering arcs before the bow. Their bodies flashed briefly in sunlight before vanishing again into the deep. They did not signal land. They signaled warmth. That evening, as twilight gathered slowly across the western sky, the sea reflected the fading light in muted bronze tones. The horizon softened rather than sharpened. I remained at the rail longer than required, allowing the slow dimming to settle the mind. "You look for something," the captain observed quietly, as he approached. "I look for continuity," I replied. He considered this, then rested his hands upon the rail beside mine. "There is no break in it," he said. "No," I answered, "but sometimes the mind seeks one." We stood without speech as darkness completed its descent. The stars revealed themselves gradually. First the brighter bodies, then the faint lattice that fills the spaces between. The sky in these latitudes seemed broader somehow, the arc of constellations more expansive. I took bearings with deliberate calm, aligning the sextant against a horizon nearly indistinguishable in the dark. The vessel's rise and fall complicated precision, yet practice compensates for motion. Each reading confirmed what instinct already suggested. We held true. Below deck, the crew prepared for the night watches. Lantern light flickered along timbered walls, casting elongated shadows that swayed gently with the hull. Sleep came more readily now that discipline had settled into the bones. Even the younger sailors who once counted days aloud had ceased such habit. Time no longer required announcement. During the second watch, clouds gathered in low formations far to the south. They did not approach with menace, yet their presence altered the horizon's texture. The wind freshened briefly, then steadied again. I adjusted my estimates conservatively, allowing for drift that might not yet reveal itself. The sea beneath us darkened to a deeper indigo, almost black, though its motion remained unchanged. Phosphorescence began to trail faintly in our wake, small sparks igniting and extinguishing in the churned water. It was not brilliant, but persistent, as though the ocean marked our passage in quiet acknowledgement. I rested my hands upon the rail and felt the steady vibration of the hull beneath my palms. Wood against water, wind against canvas, man against distance. On the 53rd day, a calm fell so gently that it might have been mistaken for imagination. The wind did not cease entirely, but it softened to a low breath. The sails hung with diminished tension. The vessel's forward motion continued, yet more languidly. No order was given. The sea flattened slightly, reducing its long arc to smaller undulations. The soundscape shifted with it. Where once the rigging hummed steadily, now it creaked intermittently. The hull no longer cut the water with firm insistence, but parted it with quiet persistence. Such calms test patience differently than storms. Storms demand action. Calms demand endurance. The crew sensed the change and moved with slower steps, as though mirroring the sea's restraint. Conversations rose briefly, then settled again. No one spoke of delay, yet all understood that progress, though continuing, had diminished. I took new measurements at noon and confirmed that our movement remained measurable, slower but steady. "It is enough," the captain said after reviewing the figures. "It is," I agreed. The sky remained clear for 2 days thereafter, the sun descending each evening in uninterrupted brilliance. Heat intensified on deck. The air carried a faint sweetness, not previously present, though so subtle that it might have been suggestion rather than scent. I did not speak of it. There is a danger in announcing anticipation before it is certain. Instead, I continued my routine without alteration. By the 55th night, the swell resumed its earlier breadth. The wind returned with quiet confidence, filling canvas more fully once again. The vessel leaned into its course with renewed assurance. The wake brightened faintly beneath starlight. The crossing was not yet complete, but the sea had shifted in character. Not visibly, not dramatically, but perceptibly. We sailed on. On the 58th evening, since the last outline of Spain had dissolved into memory, the sky opened with unusual clarity. The horizon stood clean and sharp, dividing sea from firmament with precise distinction. The air held warmth even after sunset, though a faint current of cooler breath drifted across the deck as darkness deepened. Such nights are gifts to a navigator. The swell remained long and dignified, lifting the vessel in measured arcs that allowed for steadier sighting than usual. I brought the sextant from its case with deliberate care, wiping a trace of salt from the glass before raising it toward the stars. Polaris shone steady above the northern horizon, though lower than when we began. I aligned its reflection against the dark line of sea, waiting through the vessel's rise and fall until the arc settled into balance. The angle held firm. I recorded the altitude carefully. Then I turned to other bodies, Arcturus descending, Vega bright in the east, the subtle arc of lesser stars forming their quiet geometry overhead. Each reading required patience. Each confirmation reinforced the integrity of our course. Navigation at night is not merely calculation. It is reconciliation. The sea moves. The vessel moves. The sky appears unmoving. The navigator must account for all three and yet remain still within himself. The captain approached without sound. "Well?" he asked softly. "We remain true," I answered. He looked upward for a long moment as though measuring the heavens without instrument. "It is a strange comfort," he said, "to trust what we cannot touch." "We touch it through number," I replied. He nodded once. "See that the numbers remain faithful." After he departed, I remained at the rail longer than required, tracing the arc of the constellations as they advanced slowly westward. The sea beneath reflected faint starlight in scattered glimmers. Phosphorescent streaks trailed our wake, igniting briefly before fading into darkness. The crew slept more deeply that night. Perhaps the calm had eased their restlessness. Perhaps endurance had matured into acceptance. Whatever the cause, the deck held a quieter tone. Footsteps were softer, voices lower. In the stillness, I found myself recalling earlier voyages, shorter passages along the Mediterranean coast when land remained visible even at distance. In those days, I had relied too heavily upon shoreline shape and familiar markers. Fog had once concealed those guides for 3 consecutive days, forcing me to navigate by estimation alone. The unease of that lesson had never fully departed. The Atlantic had refined that early discomfort into discipline. By the 60th day, heat rose steadily from the planks by mid-morning. The air carried weight. The crew moved with shirts loosened where modesty permitted. Water rations were monitored more closely now. Not from scarcity, but from foresight. Flying fish had grown common enough to no longer draw comment. Near noon, faint strands of sargassum drifted past the hull in intermittent clusters. Not dense, not continuous, but present. Their colour contrasted against the darker blue, subtle yet undeniable. I did not alter course. Instead, I allowed the information to rest in quiet confirmation. Later that afternoon, a solitary seabird circled high above the mast, then disappeared toward the southwest. Its appearance drew a few upward glances, nothing more. One bird proves nothing. Yet absence had defined our crossing thus far. presence, however slight, altered that condition. As evening approached, the wind steadied once more from the east, filling canvas with quiet insistence. The vessel leaned with renewed confidence. The wake brightened faintly beneath gathering starlight. The sea remained vast. But something within it had begun to shift. We sailed on. By the 63rd day beyond the coast of Spain, the Atlantic had altered in a manner so gradual that no single moment marked its transition. The swell, once long and cool in tone, had softened into a broader, warmer rhythm. The air carried a thickness that lingered upon the skin even before noon. The light itself seemed less severe, diffused through a faint haze that persisted above the horizon. The sea no longer felt austere. It felt inhabited, not by land, not by visible structure, but by warmth. Morning rose gently, without sharp brilliance. The sun lifted itself through pale cloud that thinned as the day advanced, casting the surface in muted gold rather than cold silver. I stood at the rail before the crew stirred fully and watched the swell approach in long measured arcs. Each crest carried a slight translucence near its peak, sunlight filtering through the thin lip before it folded back into the trough. The vessel responded without protest. She had grown accustomed to this water. I cast the log line with deliberate calm, counting the interval of sand with steady breath. The line paid out, then returned, wet and heavy. The number announced was consistent with our established pace. We were neither slowed nor hastened, and yet the sensation of progress had altered. The crew rose with subdued energy. Movements were steady, but the heat encouraged economy. Shirts were loosened, sleeves rolled. A few men poured water over their heads at the rail, drawing quiet laughter from those nearby. No reprimand followed. Discipline had matured beyond such minor expressions. The captain observed from a distance. He rarely interfered with harmless relief. By mid-morning, the deck planks warmed noticeably beneath the hand. The air carried faint scents not present earlier in the voyage, subtle traces of vegetation borne perhaps by distant currents. The sargassum appeared again, more frequent now, drifting past in scattered mats that caught briefly in the wake before dissolving behind us. I crouched near the rail and watched the strands slip along the hull. They moved with purpose, guided by forces unseen beneath the surface. Currents announce proximity long before land consents to reveal itself. I did not speak this aloud. Instead, I recorded water temperature once more and noted its continued rise. That afternoon the sea flattened slightly, though not into calm. The swell retained its breadth, but its cresting softened. The sound against the hull diminished to a quieter murmur. Rigging no longer hummed with constant tension, but creaked intermittently as the wind adjusted by degrees, almost too small to measure. The captain joined me near the helm. "You feel it," he said. "Yes." "What do you make of it?" "Transition," I replied. He nodded once, accepting the word without further inquiry. Below deck, fatigue had given way to a more tempered endurance. The earlier restlessness had dissolved. In its place remained a subdued anticipation, though none dared articulate it directly. Even the youngest sailors had ceased counting days. The crossing had extended beyond novelty into condition. Now, change approached not with impatience, but with quiet expectancy. At sunset, the sky deepened into a richer palette than we had yet witnessed. Amber near the horizon, rose above, then violet, ascending toward night. The sea mirrored those tones in muted reflection. The wake trailed luminous streaks as darkness gathered, phosphorescence brightening with each turn of the rudder. I remained on deck long after the evening watch had settled. The stars emerged slowly, veiled at first by thin haze, then clearing with deliberate patience. I raised the sextant and aligned the instrument against a horizon steadier than many nights before. The vessel's motion had grown more predictable, the swell less erratic. Readings came cleaner. Latitude confirmed our steady southing earlier in the voyage and our resumed westing now. I marked each figure with careful script. Numbers do not excite the spirit, but they steady it. The captain approached once more. "Will we see birds soon?" he asked. "Likely," I answered. "And after birds, other signs." He rested his hands upon the rail and looked into darkness. "Men sleep more soundly when they sense approach," he said. "Approach requires no announcement," I replied. "Only confirmation." He gave the faintest sound of agreement and withdrew. Night deepened fully. The sky, cleared now of haze, revealed constellations more sharply than before. Southern stars had climbed higher above the horizon. The familiar northern guides sat lower, steady but diminished in altitude. I traced their arcs with quiet satisfaction. Navigation in these waters demands attention not only to position, but to pattern. The heavens alter subtly with latitude. One must recalibrate instinct accordingly. Below deck, the air had grown warm enough that sleep required effort. I returned briefly to my cabin and unfolded the letter once more. "My dear Isabel, the sea has softened. The air carries warmth that lingers after sunset. We remain disciplined and in good health. There are signs, small ones, that suggest transition, though I will not name them until certainty allows it." I paused, considering whether such restraint was necessary in a letter that would not reach her for months. Even in ink, I prefer caution. I wrote of the crew's steadier mood, of the captain's reserved confidence, of the stars shifting gently overhead. I wrote that distance has a way of refining patience, rather than exhausting it. I sealed the page and extinguished the lantern. On the 65th day, the first sustained presence of seabirds appeared. Not a solitary wanderer, not a passing ark, but 3 small terns that circled the mast repeatedly before veering southwest in coordinated flight. Their wings cut the air with confident motion. They did not linger long, yet their repetition was unmistakable. The crew noticed. A murmur passed along the deck. No one spoke of land, but glances increased toward the horizon. I said nothing. Instead, I continued the morning log as before. The Atlantic had not ended, but it had begun to thin. We sailed on. By the 70th day of open water, the Atlantic no longer felt endless in the way it once had. Its vastness remained, but its character had altered. Where earlier weeks carried a sensation of pure expanse, now the sea seemed inhabited by subtle indication, as though distance itself were thinning. Nothing visible confirmed this impression, yet something in the motion of water and air suggested proximity to change. The swell had shifted again. It no longer approached in perfectly uniform arcs from the east. A secondary motion had begun to ride beneath it, faint but perceptible, a cross-current moving at slight variance to our heading. The vessel compensated naturally, her hull adjusting in small degrees that only experienced hands would recognize. I felt it through the rail before I observed it with the eye. Currents speak quietly. I tested the water at dawn with a lowered bucket and found its warmth increased beyond earlier measures. The surface temperature held steady at a level that would have seemed improbable weeks before. Heat rose from the deck planks earlier each morning. The air carried weight that lingered against the lungs, not unpleasant, but full. Sargassum appeared in broader fields now, not dense enough to impede progress, yet unmistakably more frequent. The strands drifted past in quiet procession, their golden threads catching light before slipping beneath our stern. Small crabs clung to the mats, startled briefly by the vessel's passage before vanishing again into floating shelter. The crew noticed, not with speech but with attention. Seabirds increased in number over successive days. At first, 2 or 3 would circle high and depart. Then, small groups began to appear in the morning hours, tracing arcs above the mast before orienting southwestward. Their flight carried purpose. They did not wander aimlessly as earlier solitary visitors had done. One of the younger sailors stood beside me at the rail as 3 terns crossed our wake in tight formation. "They return somewhere," he said. "Yes," I replied. "Then somewhere exists. It always has." He considered this without further question. The captain approached later that afternoon, his gaze lingering upon the western horizon, longer than usual. "You calculate land?" he asked quietly. "I calculate transition," I answered. "Distance? Reduced?" He nodded once, satisfied not with certainty but with trajectory. The sky that evening carried a faint discoloration near the horizon, almost imperceptible, unless studied with care. A slight deepening of blue toward green, so subtle it might have been dismissed as imagination. I did not dismiss it. The scent in the air altered gradually as well. Salt remained dominant, yet beneath it lay a trace of something organic, carried intermittently upon the wind. Not constant, not strong, but present. I did not announce it. The sea tests patience even at the edge of arrival. That night the stars shone through scattered cloud that moved in thin, elongated bands. I took my readings with deliberate calm, aware that approach invites overconfidence. The altitude of Polaris confirmed our position within expected variance. The southern stars climbed fractionally higher. We were where we intended to be. Yet confirmation requires repetition. The following day brought increased bird activity. 5, then 7, then a small flock that lingered longer than any before. They circled the mast repeatedly, their calls sharp but not frantic. One settled briefly upon the yardarm before lifting again toward the southwest. The crew gathered small observations into private understanding. Conversation quieted when birds appeared. Eyes followed their direction. Below deck, preparations altered subtly. Water casks were inspected with renewed attention. Equipment secured more carefully than routine required. No order had been given. The crossing itself had instructed them. On the 73rd day, the swell shortened unexpectedly near midday. Not a storm swell, not turbulence, but a compression of wave pattern, as though the sea encountered resistance beyond sight. The vessel's motion altered slightly, rising and descending in quicker intervals. I recalculated drift and leeway with careful conservatism. The compass remained faithful. The captain joined me at the helm. "You feel it," he said. "Yes." "Shoals?" "Not yet," I replied, "but influence." He did not press further. The afternoon brought a more persistent scent carried upon steady wind. Vegetation unmistakable now, though faint. The kind of aroma that cannot originate from open water alone. A murmur passed along the deck. No land was visible. The horizon remained clear and unbroken. Yet expectation compressed the air more than heat. I instructed the helmsman to maintain strict adherence to heading. Approach temps deviation. I would not allow eagerness to alter discipline. As dusk descended, the western sky deepened to amber, then violet. A slight haze gathered low upon the horizon, darker than cloud yet not defined. I studied it through narrowed eyes. Clouds move. This did not. Still, distance can distort perception. I marked its bearing quietly in the log. The crew sensed my scrutiny. No one asked. Night came fully, obscuring whatever had lingered at the edge of sight. The stars resumed dominion overhead. I took my readings with greater care than usual, confirming position twice before closing the book. If land lay ahead, it would reveal itself at dawn. We slept in suspended certainty. The Atlantic had not ended, but it had begun to narrow. We sailed on. On the 74th morning beyond Spain, I rose before the bell, and not from habit alone, but from a quiet awareness that sleep had thinned. The air carried a weight different from previous dawns. It was not cooler nor warmer, but altered, as though something beyond sight influenced its character. The sky remained dark when I stepped upon the deck. Only a faint band of paling light marked the eastern horizon. To the west, darkness held longer, dense and indistinct. The sea moved beneath us in shortened arcs, its motion subtly compressed compared to earlier weeks. The helmsman stood steady, eyes forward. "Any change?" I asked quietly. "None seen," he replied. I walked to the rail and narrowed my gaze toward the western horizon. At first there was nothing, only the familiar division of sea and sky. Yet after several long breaths I perceived a faint irregularity along the line. Not height, not shape. A subtle deepening of tone, darker than cloud yet without the definition of storm. Clouds shift. This held. I said nothing. Anticipation is dangerous when voiced prematurely. The captain emerged moments later, coat loosely fastened, expression unreadable. "You are awake early," he observed. "As are you." He followed my gaze westward. "You see it?" "I see difference," I replied. We stood in silence as the eastern sky brightened incrementally. Light expanded behind us first, washing the sea in pale silver before advancing westward. The darker band ahead remained fixed. Bird calls reached us faintly, more numerous than any morning before. Small shapes crossed above the mast in deliberate flight, not wandering but purposeful. The crew stirred slowly, sensing the altered tone before understanding its cause. Movement along the deck increased, conversations hushed. As the sun broke free of the horizon, its light stretched long across the water toward the west. The faint irregularity sharpened by degrees. What had seemed merely shadow now revealed slight elevation, a discontinuity in the perfect arc of sea. Land does not rise dramatically from distance. It accumulates definition. A low ridge became perceptible, then another beyond it. The haze that had obscured shape began to thin under strengthening light. Green emerged faintly within the darker line. No one shouted. The first confirmation of land is not noise. It is stillness. The captain exhaled slowly. "Well done," he said, though the words were not triumph, but acknowledgement. "We are not yet there," I replied. He nodded. "No. But we are no longer nowhere." Relief passed through the crew, not as celebration, but as release. Shoulders eased, glances exchanged. One of the younger sailors crossed himself quietly near the rail. I returned to the helm. "Maintain course," I instructed. "Approach tempts alteration." The sea ahead altered in colour as distance diminished. The deep indigo of open Atlantic shifted gradually toward layered blues and greens. Swell patterns grew more complex, refracting subtly as they encountered unseen contours beneath the surface. The vessel's motion changed. Where earlier she had risen and fallen in broad, uninterrupted arcs, now she encountered slight resistance from beneath, an undercurrent reflecting from distant shoals. I recalculated depth estimation based on water coloration and swell behavior. Soundings will begin within the hour, I said quietly to the captain. He inclined his head. The crew's focus sharpened. Tasks were performed with renewed attention, lines inspected, sails adjusted with greater precision. No one wished to mar the final approach through carelessness. Birds increased in number steadily. Their cries, once distant, now layered the air with sharp clarity. Some descended low over the water, skimming the surface before lifting toward the coastline. The scent strengthened. Vegetation unmistakable now. Warm, green, alive. The Atlantic had narrowed to channel. We advanced cautiously, and still I felt no elation. Land demands as much discipline as sea. We sailed on. The first sight of land does not end a crossing. It transforms it. By full morning light, the faint western shadow had gathered form enough that no disciplined eye could mistake it for cloud. The horizon no longer described a perfect arc. Instead, it bore interruption. Low ridges rising and falling in uneven contour, softened by distance but undeniable in structure. What had been abstraction became geography. The crew did not cheer. They watched. Men who had spent more than 70 days within uninterrupted horizon now confronted variation, and the effect was almost solemn. One does not greet land as spectacle after such duration. One regards it with gravity. The sun climbed steadily, sharpening relief and as diminishing haze. Greens emerged faintly through the morning light. Not vivid, not distinct, but present. The coastline revealed layered shapes, a nearer ridge low and dark, a higher formation beyond, and between them a lighter seam that might have been beach or simply shifting reflection. I did not allow attention to linger on beauty. "Maintain heading," I instructed the helmsman. He nodded, hands steady upon the wheel. The sea beneath us altered perceptibly as distance closed. The swell that had carried us for weeks in broad, uninterrupted lines now encountered resistance. Waves refracted subtly, their crests bending slightly before reaching the hull. Beneath the surface, unseen contours redirected motion upward in compressed intervals. This is the ocean's first warning. Approach is more complex than crossing. The captain joined me at the rail, his gaze scanning both coastline and water between. "Depth?" he asked. "Uncertain," I replied. "Color suggests rising floor." Indeed, the water had shifted from deep cobalt to layered turquoise nearer the horizon. Lighter bands interrupted darker channels. The transition did not occur abruptly. It unfolded in gradients that required patient observation. I ordered the lead prepared. A sailor moved forward with weighted line, coiled and ready. The crew understood the implication, without explanation. Open ocean had required calculation. Coastal water required measurement. The first sounding was taken at cautious distance. The line descended. The call returned with number sufficient for comfort, though shallower than any depth recorded in recent weeks. "Hold steady," I said. The vessel advanced. Birds multiplied overhead, not in scattered twos and threes, but in sustained presence. Their cries layered the air with sharp insistence. Some wheeled directly above us before veering inland. Others skimmed low across the bow, riding invisible currents with casual mastery. The scent of land intensified, unmistakable now. Warm vegetation, faint earth, something alive beyond salt. The crew inhaled deeply without comment. It is a rare thing to smell soil after 70 days of brine. As the sun reached mid-morning height, the coastline resolved further. I could now distinguish irregularities, what appeared to be breaks in ridge, perhaps inlets or river mouths. Darker vertical lines suggested trees rising above undergrowth. A pale stretch at the base of one slope reflected sunlight in a manner consistent with sand. Yet beauty must not distract from hazard. The water ahead displayed alternating bands of colour, deeper channels cutting through lighter shelves, swell patterns bent and recombined unpredictably. The vessel's motion grew less uniform. Instead of broad ascents and descents, she encountered subtle shifts in resistance, as though invisible hands pressed against her keel from varying directions. "Sound again?" I ordered. The lead descended. The call returned lower than previous measure. The captain's jaw tightened slightly. "We adjust?" he asked. "Not yet." To alter course prematurely would invite greater complication. Instead, I observed the swell's break pattern carefully. Where waves rose more sharply and folded sooner, depth diminished. Where they travelled long and smooth, channel likely continued. We edged slightly starboard, correcting by degrees small enough to avoid dramatic shift, yet sufficient to test deeper water. The next sounding increased. Good. The helmsman held steady, though I sensed a tension in his posture unfamiliar from open sea. Coastal navigation carries different weight. Error is no longer abstract. The crew grew quieter. Land, now unmistakable, rose in textured layers ahead. Sunlight struck slopes in uneven patches. A faint line of surf shimmered at the base of one distant reef, its white arc visible only when crest caught light. I marked its bearing immediately. Reefs announce themselves with broken water. We were not yet near it, but approach compresses distance quickly. By midday, heat intensified further. The air lay heavy across deck. The water's turquoise bands brightened under direct sun, revealing intricate variations that open ocean never displays. Shadows beneath the surface suggested ridges, though depth remained adequate. "Ease sail slightly," I instructed. "Speed must yield to caution." Canvas adjusted. The vessel's forward motion diminished modestly. Wake narrowed. Another sounding. Lower again. 2 points starboard, I said calmly. The helmsman complied, turning the wheel with measured precision. For a brief moment the hull vibrated differently. Not impact, not contact, but altered resistance. I felt it through the rail before hearing any sound. The captain's head turned sharply. Depth? Marginal, came the call from forward. We were skirting the edge of rising shelf. Hold her, I said. No further. The vessel stabilized within the deeper band. The swell ahead displayed broken patterns slightly to port, subtle white caps where water met obstruction beneath. The helmsman adjusted his grip unconsciously. Approach demands nerve. Land lay visible now, textured and alive in midday light. But between us and shore stretched complexity. We advanced, slowly, deliberately, and beneath anticipation lay quiet tension. We sailed on. By early afternoon, the coastline stood fully formed against the sky, its slopes now distinct in contour, its ridges layered in alternating bands of light and shadow. What had begun as a distant interruption had resolved into terrain, rising hills, darker valleys, a pale strip that could only be shore. Yet between us and that visible certainty lay water that refused simplicity. The sea ahead shifted in bands of turquoise and deep blue, channels weaving through lighter shelves, whose boundaries were not straight but irregular, curving with hidden contours beneath the surface. The swell that had carried us faithfully across the Atlantic now fractured as it encountered submerged formations. Waves bent subtly, their crests collapsing sooner in some places, running longer in others. I ordered sail eased further. Speed is enemy to precision in shallow water. The helmsman held steady as we followed what appeared to be the deeper channel, its darker tones suggesting safer passage. Soundings continued at measured intervals, each call announced without haste. 5 fathoms. Adequate. 4.5. Marginal but navigable. We edged slightly starboard again, adjusting by degrees. The vessel responded obediently, her bow turning with restrained grace. Birds circled in increasing number now, their cries layered and constant. The scent of vegetation drifted steadily across the deck. The crew's breathing seemed deeper, as though drawing something long denied. Then it happened. Not impact, not shock, but a change in tone. I felt it first through the soles of my boots, a faint alteration in the vibration of the hull, subtle but unmistakable. The vessel's forward motion did not halt, yet something beneath us had shifted from open glide to textured resistance. A moment later came the sound. Not a crack. Not a grind. A brief, roughened whisper along the keel. The helmsman's hands tightened. The captain's head turned sharply. Depth? He called. The lead dropped immediately. The line descended slower than before. 3 fathoms! Lower than comfort. The scrape came again, slightly more pronounced this time, a muted fibrous contact, as though wood brushed coarse stone. Port 2 points, I said calmly. Not shouted, not sharp, measured. The helmsman complied at once, turning the wheel with deliberate strength. The vessel responded sluggishly for a heartbeat, then eased away from resistance. The vibration shifted again, returning to smoother glide. Sound? The lead descended once more. 4 fathoms. Better. We had grazed the outer lip of a reef shelf. The captain's gaze fixed forward. "Hold her steady," he said, voice level but firm. The crew moved without panic. Lines adjusted, sails eased further to reduce forward drive. No man shouted, no accusation passed lips. The helmsman swallowed once, but did not falter. The water to port showed faint whitening, where swell broke prematurely across hidden coral. The darker channel lay slightly to starboard, its path winding but deeper. "Another point starboard," I instructed. The vessel complied, her hull gliding now through water whose colour deepened subtly. The scraping did not return. Soundings confirmed increasing depth. 3.5, then 4, then 4.5. We had crossed the reef's outer shoulder. The captain exhaled slowly. "You felt it before you heard it," he said quietly. "Yes. And you trusted it." "I trusted the change." He nodded. "Good." The crew resumed their rhythm, though with sharpened awareness. Relief did not manifest in speech, but in posture, shoulders easing slightly, breath releasing. The helmsman remained steady at the wheel. "Stay with it," I said quietly beside him. He nodded once. Land lay ahead, green and immovable. The sea between us had tested attention. We advanced again, slower, more deliberate. The Atlantic had ended. The coast had begun. Once clear of the reef's outer shoulder, the vessel entered water whose tone shifted from uncertain turbulence to layered complexity. The darker channel curved gently toward a break in the coastline, what appeared to be a natural inlet between 2 low ridges. The swell, no longer long and uniform, fractured into cross patterns, influenced by submerged contours, invisible to the eye, but readable in motion. I remained beside the helm, observing not only the water ahead, but the behavior of waves at angles beyond our bow. Where crests rose abruptly and folded inward upon themselves, depth diminished. Where they stretched and passed uninterrupted, channel likely continued. "Reduce sail further," I instructed. Canvas slackened. Speed diminished to deliberate pace. The crew moved with sharpened discipline now. The earlier scrape had not frightened them. It had clarified the nature of our transition. Open ocean forgives gradual error. Coastal water does not. Soundings continued at shortened intervals. 4 fathoms. 3.75. 4 again. The numbers oscillated as we followed the darker band. The helmsman corrected gently with each instruction, his movements now measured, stripped of earlier anticipation. I sensed in him a renewed humility. Not fear, but awareness. The captain surveyed the coastline carefully. The slopes ahead rose in textured green, broken by occasional exposed stone. Near the base of the inlet, I could now distinguish what appeared to be a pale beach, beyond which dense vegetation climbed in irregular layers. The water within the inlet shimmered lighter than the channel outside. "Inside looks calmer," the captain observed. "Inside may conceal further shoal," I replied. He smiled faintly. "You never surrender caution." "Caution is a rival," I said. By late afternoon, the angle of light sharpened the underwater topography further. Shadows revealed ridges beneath the surface. The channel narrowed perceptibly as it approached the inlet's mouth, then appeared to deepen slightly beyond. Birds moved in constant arcs overhead, some diving briefly toward the water before lifting again. Their confidence in this place contrasted with our deliberate hesitation. A current began to press gently from starboard, subtle but persistent. I adjusted our heading by a degree to compensate, ensuring we did not drift toward lighter bands. 3 fathoms. 3.5. The lead sang its numbers in steady rhythm. We entered the mouth of the inlet with sails nearly slack, relying more upon steerage than momentum. The swell diminished dramatically once within its partial shelter. Water smoothed, though small cross ripples hinted at submerged rock. The crew relaxed incrementally as motion steadied. Yet I did not. Sheltered water can deceive. The channel inside curved again, forming a natural basin bordered by sloping shore. Depth increased modestly, then shallowed again near the inner edge. The captain looked toward me. "Anchor here?" he asked. The sun had begun its slow descent toward the western ridge, casting long shadows across the basin. Light glittered across shallower areas, obscuring detail. "Not yet," I said. He raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "Light is against us. Depth unclear in fading glare. Better to hold just outside and enter fully at morning." He considered, then nodded. "Prudence, once proven, is seldom challenged." We eased the vessel slightly back toward deeper channel water, allowing her to ride gentle current at reduced speed while remaining clear of inner shoal. The crew's posture reflected restrained anticipation. Land lay within clear sight. The scent of vegetation drifted steadily. The basin ahead promised calm anchorage. Yet night complicates first entry. As sunset deepened, we positioned ourselves just beyond the inlet mouth, maintaining safe depth while preparing for controlled hold. Sails were trimmed minimally. The vessel faced into gentle current. The coastline darkened gradually, its greens dissolving into layered shadow. Above it, the sky bloomed in amber, then crimson, then deepening violet. Birds settled inland in scattered flight. The sea within the inlet stilled to glass. Outside, our vessel rose gently in modest swell. The captain stood beside me as darkness gathered. "We could go in," he said softly. "Yes," I replied. "But we will not." "No." He exhaled, satisfied. "Very well." Night near land carries a different character than night in open sea. Sounds travel differently. The scent intensifies. The darkness feels less infinite, more contained. We set anchor lightly in deeper outer channel water, sufficient to hold position without drifting toward shoal. The chain descended with muted authority. The hull steadied. The crew moved quietly, their energy subdued by completion, yet restrained by discipline. Land lay close, but arrival would wait for morning. We would enter properly. The night we spent offshore was unlike any night of the crossing. In open Atlantic darkness, the horizon disappears entirely. Sea and sky merge without boundary, and the mind adjusts to infinity. But here, with land resting just beyond reach, the darkness possessed contour. Even without moonlight, I could sense the massive coastline to starboard, not visible in detail, yet present as a deeper absence against the sky. The anchor chain held us steady in deeper outer water, its tension humming faintly through the hull. The swell beyond the inlet mouth remained gentle, lifting and lowering the vessel with patient rhythm. Within the basin ahead I could hear quieter water lapping against hidden shore. The crew settled more easily than expected. The sight of land had eased something in them, even though we had not yet set foot upon it. Conversations were muted. Laughter surfaced briefly and faded. One man hummed a hymn under his breath before sleep claimed him. I remained on deck. The captain joined me for a time, his posture less rigid than during the crossing. "We are here," he said quietly. "We are near," I replied. He accepted the distinction. The air carried full scent now. Vegetation warmed by day, earth breathing into night, faint sweetness unfamiliar after months of salt alone. It drifted across the water in subtle waves, strengthening and fading with shifting breeze. I closed my eyes briefly and inhaled deeply. 74 days at sea compress a man's senses. Arrival expands them again. The stars overhead shone brightly, unimpeded by cloud. Yet their arrangement felt altered, not by latitude alone, but by context. They no longer governed emptiness. They hovered above destination. I took one final reading, more from habit than necessity, confirming our position relative to shoreline shadow. The numbers aligned with expectation. The inlet lay precisely where earlier estimation had placed it. Precision brings quiet satisfaction. Below deck, the crew slept with steadier breath. The helmsman who had grazed the reef earlier rested near the bulkhead, his expression no longer tense. Error, corrected calmly, becomes instruction rather than stain. I returned briefly to my cabin and unfolded the letter to Isabel once more. "My dearest, we have sighted land. It rose first as shadow, then form. We approached cautiously and now lie just beyond its shelter, waiting for morning light to guide our proper entry. The scent of earth reaches us even here. It is a strange comfort after so long, with only salt upon the air." I paused, considering how to describe the moment without excess. There was no triumph, only relief. I wrote that the sea had taught patience. That arrival requires as much discipline as departure. That faith steadies the hand not only in storm, but in quiet water where decision matters most. I sealed the page once more. Back on deck, the captain had withdrawn. Only 2 men stood watch. The coastline remained dark, its ridges indistinct yet undeniable. Sometime past midnight, the breeze shifted slightly offshore, carrying cooler air from inland heights. The scent deepened briefly, then softened again. I leaned against the rail and allowed memory to pass through me. Earlier voyages along Mediterranean coastlines. Harbours entered too hastily in fading light. The embarrassment of correcting anchor position at dawn, when depth proved misjudged. Experience is often shaped by small miscalculations more than grand events. We would not misjudge this one. The swell outside the inlet pulsed steadily through the night, never threatening, merely present. The hull answered with muted creaks that had become familiar companions. Near dawn, the eastern sky began to pale once more. I did not sleep. Arrival deserves witness. The eastern horizon softened from indigo to silver without spectacle. Dawn near land does not erupt as it does upon open ocean. It unfolds gradually, revealing contour rather than emptiness. The coastline that had rested as shadow through the night began to separate itself into ridges and folds as light advanced across the water. The anchor chain trembled faintly as the tide shifted. The vessel adjusted her orientation by degrees, turning gently into the incoming current that pressed from beyond the inlet. I studied the surface patterns carefully. Ripples within the mouth of the basin moved differently now than they had at sunset. What had appeared smooth from distance now revealed intricate cross-currents influenced by tide and submerged stone. "Raise anchor," I said quietly. The crew moved with disciplined efficiency. No urgency, no noise beyond necessary labour. The chain rose link by link, wet and dark before clearing the water. The vessel drifted momentarily, then responded as the helmsman engaged steerage once more. The sun crested the eastern ridge slowly, its light sliding across the slopes of green ahead and illuminating the basin interior. Details emerged that night had concealed. A narrow sandbar curved along the northern edge of the inlet. To the south, darker patches beneath the surface marked coral shelves, extending further inward than expected. I recalculated our intended path. "Hold to starboard channel," I instructed. The darker band of water traced a sinuous line through lighter turquoise fields. It narrowed briefly near the inlet mouth, then broadened again inside. The key would be patience. Soundings resumed at shortened intervals. 4 fathoms. 3.5. Adequate. The swell beyond the inlet diminished as we crossed fully into its shelter. Motion smoothed. The hull glided more evenly. Birds crossed overhead in steady arcs, some settling upon the water near shore before lifting again. The scent intensified under morning warmth. Earth, leaf, faint blossom. The crew breathed it as if rediscovering air itself. The helmsman moved with greater restraint now, each correction slight, deliberate. I stood beside him, not from distrust, but from shared focus. "There," I said softly, indicating a lighter band ahead, where water shallowed abruptly, near a coral outcrop. He adjusted a degree to port. The vessel obeyed. 3 fathoms. We passed safely. Inside the basin, depth increased modestly toward its center. The water darkened again, suggesting a pocket deep enough for anchorage. The surface here lay calmer still, only small ripples betraying subtle tidal movement. The captain surveyed the space. "This will hold," he said. "Yes." We circled once at minimal speed to confirm consistency of depth. 4 fathoms. 4.25. Stable. The slopes surrounding the basin rose in layered vegetation, interrupted occasionally by exposed rock. No visible habitation revealed itself. Smoke did not rise. No canoe disturbed the water's surface. The place appeared untouched, though I knew better than to assume absence of watchers. "Prepare to anchor," I said. The crew responded with quiet readiness. The anchor, cleared and positioned, hung poised above the surface as we aligned the vessel into gentle current. "Let go." The anchor dropped cleanly, chain following in measured descent. A moment later the line drew taut. The hull pivoted slowly, settling into stable orientation, facing the inlet mouth. I watched carefully for drift. None came. The basin held us. Silence followed. Not emptiness, but completion. The crew stood momentarily without instruction, absorbing the stillness of anchored water after 74 days of motion. One man laughed softly under his breath, then stopped as though uncertain whether sound was appropriate. The captain approached me. "Well guided," he said. "The sea permitted it," I replied. He smiled faintly. "You will never take full credit." There is none to take. The sun rose higher, warming the deck and igniting the greens along the shore. Light reflected in shimmering patterns across the basin's surface. Small fish darted near the hull, visible in clarity, impossible in open ocean. The helmsman, who had grazed the reef earlier, approached quietly. "I held too eager yesterday," he said. "You corrected," I replied. He nodded once, accepting the lesson. The crew began routine tasks, securing lines, inspecting hull where possible, organizing stores for eventual landing party. Yet movement remained measured, as though no one wished to disturb the basin's calm prematurely. I leaned against the rail and allowed myself a final survey of the inlet. Its protective arms of green, its quiet interior water, its absence of visible human mark. After 74 days, we had crossed from abstraction into place. The Atlantic lay behind us, vast and patient. Before us lay terrain not yet known. I closed the logbook with steady hand. Arrival is not noise, it is alignment. and for the first time since leaving Spain, the vessel did not move. The basin held us through the morning without disturbance. As the sun climbed fully above the eastern ridge, light poured across the sheltered water in expanding sheets of gold. The Atlantic swell that had shaped our bodies for weeks could no longer be felt here. Instead, the vessel rested in gentle oscillation, responding only to faint tide and the lightest inland breeze. For the first time since leaving Spain, silence felt complete. Not absence of sound, but absence of vastness. Bird calls echoed from the slopes beyond the sandbar, distinct now, layered and varied. Insects hummed faintly near shore. The scent of vegetation deepened as warmth increased, carrying notes of leaf, bark, and something floral that drifted across the basin in subtle waves. The crew moved about their duties more slowly than during the crossing, not from fatigue, but from adjustment. Bodies accustomed to perpetual motion require time to understand stillness. Several men stood at the rail longer than necessary, gazing toward the shore as though verifying its persistence. The captain ordered a small boat prepared for sounding along the inner curve of the basin. Not landing, merely measurement. Precision remains discipline even after arrival. I joined the boat with 2 sailors and the helmsman, whose expression carried quiet determination. The oars entered the water softly, their rhythm different from the thrust of open sea labor. The basin responded with minimal resistance. From water level, the slopes appeared taller than they had from deck. The sandbar revealed faint patterns of ripple formed by tide. Beneath the clear surface, coral formations rose in intricate structures, their edges pale against deeper sand channels. We took soundings at measured intervals. 3 fathoms, 2.5 near shore. The depths confirmed our earlier estimate. The anchorage was secure within its center, though approach must remain cautious. Returning to the vessel, I noted the clarity of water around the hull. Small fish moved in darting patterns beneath us. Sea grasses waved gently in shallower margins of the basin. The crew lowered casks carefully to rinse salt from their surfaces. Laughter returned in modest measure. One man splashed water across his face repeatedly, smiling without restraint. The captain observed from the quarter-deck. "Controlled joy," he said quietly. "Yes. Unrestrained exuberance leads to carelessness. We would not allow it." By midday, heat intensified. The basin air grew thick yet not oppressive. Shade along the starboard side offered relief. Some of the crew rested briefly while others inspected rigging for wear accumulated during the crossing. I descended once more to my cabin and unfolded the letter to Isabel. We are anchored in a basin sheltered by green slopes and pale sand. The crossing has ended without loss. There was a moment of caution near reef, but discipline prevailed. I have thought often of the Mass we would have attended together. Here, without church or bell, I offered quiet prayer at dawn for safe arrival. I paused, considering whether to describe the basin's beauty in detail. I chose restraint. Beauty is better witnessed than described. Back on deck, the captain joined me at the rail. "We will land tomorrow," he said. "Yes. Today we observe." "Observation is first claim," I replied. He smiled faintly at the phrase. The afternoon passed in measured tasks. Sails were inspected for minor tears. The hull was examined where visible. Provisions tallied. Water stores evaluated against potential inland source. Toward evening, shadows lengthened across the basin. The water's surface mirrored the slopes in softened reflection. The sound of insects increased. A faint rustle in vegetation hinted at unseen life beyond sight. The crew gathered for simple meal on deck, seated in small groups, conversation low but steady. No shouting, no rough jesting. The presence of land moderated tone instinctively. The helmsman approached once more, his earlier tension replaced with calm resolve. "You felt the reef before I saw it," he said. "The sea speaks differently near shore," I replied. "I will listen sooner next time." "You already have." He nodded, satisfied. As dusk descended, the sky above the basin glowed in layered color, amber fading to rose, then violet. The Atlantic beyond the inlet darkened first, then the slopes followed, their green dissolving into silhouette. The vessel remained steady upon her anchor, chain firm, hull unmoving, save for gentle tide. I remained at the rail as stars emerged overhead. The same constellations that had guided us across open ocean now hovered above anchored water. Their positions unchanged, yet their meaning altered. In crossing, they represent direction. At anchor, they represent continuity. I whispered a brief prayer of gratitude, not for conquest, not for discovery, but for safe passage and measured hand. 74 days from Spain. The Atlantic lay complete behind us. Tomorrow, we would step upon new ground. Tonight we rested between sea and shore, and for the first time since departure, the vessel did not carry us forward. She held. The first full light of morning at anchor unfolded without the vast theatrical sweep of ocean dawn. It rose instead with measured clarity, revealing basin, shore, and vessel, as if lifting a veil from forms already known. A thin line of silver traced the eastern ridge before the sun itself appeared. The water within the basin held that light gently, reflecting it in softened patterns that rippled toward our hull. Beyond the inlet mouth, the Atlantic retained deeper tone, its open swell moving in patient repetition. For the first time in 74 days, I did not calculate departure at dawn. I observed. The crew stirred gradually, their movements slower than during crossing mornings. There was no immediate demand for sail trim or heading correction. Instead, men emerged from below deck and paused at the rail, gazing toward the sandbar and the slopes rising beyond it. No one spoke loudly. Land commands quiet. The scent of vegetation arrived more clearly in the cool of morning. It carried damp earth, leaf, faint sweetness from unseen bloom. Insects traced small arcs near the water's edge. A bird with long wings skimmed the surface of the basin before lifting toward the trees. The captain joined me without formal greeting. "We are well placed," he said. "Yes." "No drift?" "None." He nodded once and rested both hands upon the rail. The basin revealed more detail as light strengthened. The pale sand along the northern curve showed faint ripple marks left by night tide. Darker coral patches beneath clear water outlined the shallower margins we had avoided at entry. The deeper pocket where we anchored remained steady in colour. Precision at dusk had become confirmation at dawn. The helmsman approached quietly, standing a respectful distance from us. "I would go ashore carefully," he said. "Yes," I replied, "not in haste." "Never in haste." He nodded and withdrew. I walked the deck slowly, tracing the vessel's perimeter as I had done countless times at sea. The difference lay not in wood beneath hand, but in what surrounded it. No longer infinite horizon, but contained space. The basin held us gently, as though acknowledging our arrival without ceremony. The Atlantic beyond the inlet continued its measured pulse. Though sheltered here, we were not separated from it. Its rhythm remained audible through distant swell. The crossing could not be erased by anchorage. It had shaped us. I retrieved the sextant from its case one final time, not to calculate position, but to observe the sun's angle over inland ridge. Habit remains long after necessity fades. The instrument felt balanced in hand, its brass warmed by growing light. Numbers no longer determined survival. They marked completion. Below deck, preparations began for cautious landing party. Rope coiled, small boat inspected, water cask selected for refill attempt should inland source prove fresh. Yet no command to lower boat was given. Patience. Arrival must not dissolve discipline. The captain leaned toward me slightly. "You will step ashore first." "I will step when ordered," I replied. He smiled faintly. "You prefer deference, even at arrival. Navigation ends at shoreline." He considered that and nodded. The crew assembled near midship, not crowding but present. Their faces carried anticipation, tempered by fatigue of long crossing. They had endured heat, monotony, uncertainty, and the vast indifference of open sea. Now they stood within sight of trees and sand. One of the younger sailors removed his cap briefly and crossed himself again. This time not quietly, but openly. I offered silent gratitude of my own, not for conquest, not for discovery, for safe passage. The sun rose fully above the ridge, bathing basin and vessel alike in steady gold. The slopes brightened to layered green. Shadows shortened. The water beneath us revealed faint grasses, waving near shallower edges. Still we waited. There is a final moment between sea and land that deserves preservation. a breath suspended between movement and step. I returned to the logbook and wrote a final entry for the crossing. Anchored in sheltered basin west of Spain. Depth 4 fathoms, reef contact minimal, corrected without damage. Crew intact, vessel sound, landfall confirmed at dawn, crossing complete. The words lay simple upon the page. 74 days reduced to lines. I closed the book and rested my hand upon it for a long moment. The Atlantic remained beyond the inlet mouth, vast and unconcerned with our arrival. It would carry other vessels long after we departed this basin. Its swell would rise and fall without memory of our passage. Yet for us the crossing had been singular. We had left river and familiar shore under closed sky. We had endured overcast nights without star. We had trusted dead reckoning when sight failed. We had felt current shift, scent change, bird increase. We had grazed reef lightly and corrected course. We had entered basin under fading light and chosen patience over haste. Now we stood at the threshold of new terrain. The vessel held steady beneath morning sun. The crew breathed air no longer shaped by endless salt alone. And I, having watched horizon for 74 days, allowed my gaze to rest upon fixed land without calculation. The Atlantic crossing was finished. The journey beyond it had yet to begin. The captain gave the order only after the sun had climbed high enough to flatten the glare upon the basin's surface. "Lower the boat," he said, voice calm, as if this were a routine harbour and not the end of 74 days at sea. The crew moved with practiced coordination. The small boat descended by tackle in steady measure, timber creaking softly as it met water. Oars were set in place, a cask was secured for refill, and a coil of rope laid carefully in the bow. No man leapt in haste. Discipline remained. I took my place amidships in the boat, the helmsman opposite me, 2 sailors at the oars. The captain remained aboard, watching without comment. His authority did not require proximity. The oars dipped into the basin. The first strokes felt strange, not in exertion but in rhythm. After weeks of surrendering to sail and swell, our bodies now imposed movement directly upon water. The boat responded immediately, gliding forward with quiet obedience. From this lower vantage, the vessel behind us seemed taller, more substantial, her hull rising from the basin like a resting animal. The anchor chain drew a clean line into clear water. Above, canvas hung slack in stillness. Ahead, the sandbar broadened into pale shore. Bird calls intensified as we approached. A breeze carried stronger scent from inland trees, damp earth warmed by morning sun. Insects traced small spirals above the water's edge. The helmsman kept his eyes forward, jaw set, intent upon doing this correctly. "Steady," I said softly. He nodded. Near the shallows, water changed colour abruptly, revealing coral heads beneath the surface. We angled slightly to avoid them, guiding the boat toward a small gap in the sandbar where the depth held longer. The oars slowed. The keel brushed sand lightly. Not a scrape of reef. Not a warning. A gentle contact that carried no danger. The boat settled. No one spoke for a moment. The silence was not hesitation. It was recognition. 74 days of moving water behind us. Fixed ground before us. I stepped out first, boots sinking slightly into cool sand. The shore held firm. It did not rise and fall beneath the feet. It did not shift with breath of wind. It simply was. Behind me the sailors followed, careful and quiet. One knelt briefly to touch the sand, then stood again, without drama. I looked back once toward the basin. The vessel rested at anchor, steady in morning light. The Atlantic lay beyond the inlet mouth, unseen now from this low shore, yet present in memory and muscle. We had crossed, we had arrived, and the journey that would carry us onward from this basin had begun, not with fanfare, but with the steady sound of oars returning to water.